There is something historians almost never tell you about the Black Death. They give you the numbers: 1/3 of Europe, 25 million dead, the worst catastrophe in human history. They recite these figures with the calm authority of people who were not there, and somehow the numbers make it feel distant, like a statistic, not a story. But here is what the numbers cannot tell you. The first people who encountered this disease had no name for it. They had no framework for it. They had no category in their minds that could contain what they were witnessing. They watched healthy men collapse in the morning and die before nightfall. They saw bodies swell with lumps the size of apples. They smelled something coming off the sick that no one had a word for, a sweetness mixed with rot, the smell of a body consuming itself from the inside. And not one physician in Europe could tell them why. That is where this story begins. Not with the death toll, not with the statistics, but with a moment of absolute, terrifying unknowing, when the most sophisticated civilization in the Western world looked at what was happening and had no answer. None. And in that void of explanation, something broke loose in human society that would not be put back for 2 centuries. By the time this story ends, you will understand how a plague reshaped not just who lived and who died, but who held power, who lost it, who became rich, who became a saint, and why the world that emerged from the ruins of the Black Death looks, in the most unsettling ways, remarkably like the world we live in now. Chapter 1. Death Arrived by Sea. To understand what the Black Death destroyed, you first need to understand what it found. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was crowded, ambitious, and dangerously interconnected. The great trading cities of northern Italy, Florence, Venice, Genoa, had built commercial networks that stretched from the wool markets of England to the silk roads of Central Asia. Merchants sent ships loaded with grain and cloth east into the Black Sea, and those same ships returned, bearing spices, silks, and luxury goods that the newly wealthy merchant classes of Europe had developed a taste for. This was, by the standards of the age, a globalized world. Florence alone had a population somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 people, one of the largest cities in Europe. Its banking houses lent money to kings. Its wool trade employed thousands. Its streets were loud with the arguments of merchants, the hammering of craftsmen, the bells of dozens of churches. The city was also, by any modern standard, filthy. Sewage ran in the streets. Rats moved freely between warehouses and homes. People lived packed together in a density that made the passage of disease almost inevitable, though no one at the time understood the connection. That connection between rats, fleas, and the bacteria Yersinia pestis would not be discovered for another 500 years. What the people of 14th century Europe knew about disease was almost entirely wrong. They believed illness came from corrupted air, what they called miasma, sent down from unfavourable planetary alignments. They believed that Jupiter and Saturn meeting in the sign of Aquarius had poisoned the atmosphere. They believed that the Earth itself, in certain places, exhaled a lethal vapour. These were not the beliefs of ignorant peasants. These were the conclusions of the most educated men in Europe, university physicians, royal medical advisors, the scholars of Paris and Bologna, and every single one of these theories would prove completely useless when the killing began. The story of how the Black Death reached Europe is, depending on how you look at it, either a story of accident or a story of deliberate cruelty. The plague, most historians now believe, began its westward journey somewhere in the grasslands of Central Asia. The bacteria that causes it, Yersinia pestis, is ancient, roughly 20,000 years old, and it had coexisted with rodent populations across the Eurasian steppe for millennia. What changed in the early 1400s was something in the ecological balance, perhaps a die-off in rodent populations, perhaps a climate shift that caused infected fleas to seek new hosts. The dying moved westward, carried in the fur and blood of animals, then in the bodies of the humans who came into contact with them. By the late 1340s, it had reached the shores of the Black Sea. In the Crimea, on the northern coast of that inland sea, Genoese merchants had built a trading colony called Kaffa. It was a prosperous outpost, a gateway between the luxury goods of the east and the insatiable markets of the west. And in the year 1346, the Mongol army of the Khanate of the Golden Horde laid siege to it. What happened next became one of the most consequential acts of biological warfare in human history, though neither side had a name for what they were doing. The Mongol army, according to a chronicle written by a Genoese notary named Gabriel de Musis, began dying of an unknown disease during the siege. The disease moved through their ranks with terrifying speed. Thousands died, and the commanders of the besieging army, watching their forces collapse and sensing that their campaign was lost, made a decision. They loaded the corpses of their dead onto siege engines and catapulted them over the walls of Kaffa. The intent was to spread whatever was killing them to the people inside. And it worked, perhaps not through the corpses themselves, but through the infected fleas that continued to move between the dead bodies and the living population trapped within the city walls. The Genoese merchants inside Kaffa began to die, and when enough of them had died, or when enough of the survivors understood that staying meant certain death, they fled. They got onto ships, they sailed west, and wherever they stopped, the dying began. It is worth pausing here, because this moment, Genoese merchant ships leaving the Black Sea in late 1347, is the hinge point of European history. Not a battle, not a political decision, not a great leader making a fateful choice. Just 6 sailors on wooden ships, trying to get home, carrying something invisible and lethal in the folds of their clothing and the bloodstream of the rats living in their cargo holds. The chronicle of these ships reads like a map of catastrophe in slow motion. They stopped in Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Johannes Cantacuzene watched the disease move through his capital and described it with remarkable accuracy. The high fever, the delirium, the dark deposits on the skin, the lymph nodes swelling to the size of eggs under the arm and in the groin. He noted that some people recovered unexpectedly. He did not note that he was describing something that would kill perhaps 1/3 of his city's population before it moved on. From Constantinople, the disease followed the trade routes. Ships carried it to the islands of the Aegean, to Crete, to Cyprus, to the ports of Greece and the Levant. Other ships carried it south and east, into Egypt and along the coast of North Africa. And the ships carrying Genoese merchants continued west, tracing the outlines of the Mediterranean trade network as they went, which meant that the geography of the plague spread was, in the most bitter irony, almost perfectly identical to the geography of European commercial prosperity. The more connected a city was to international trade, the more likely it was to die first. In October of 1347, a fleet of 12 Genoese merchant ships arrived at the port of Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily. The harbour master, or whoever first went aboard, immediately understood that something was catastrophically wrong. The sailors who were still alive were covered in black swellings, the buboes that would become the defining image of the Black Death. Some sailors were already dead, and those who were still living were dying in front of witnesses, their bodies doing things that bodies were not supposed to do. The ships were ordered out of the harbour. Get out, turn around, go anywhere else. But the harbour master had made his decision too late. Some of the sailors had already come ashore. Some of the rats from the ship's holds had already made their way onto the docks. The disease was already in Messina before the ships turned around. A chronicler who witnessed what followed, writing under a name, Michele da Piazza, that was almost certainly not his own, described the scene with a clarity that cuts through 7 centuries. The people of Messina realised that their sudden deaths were connected to the Genoese ships, and in their panic they drove the ships from the port, but the plague stayed. What followed in Messina was the first European preview of what would happen across the entire continent over the next 5 years. The sick were abandoned. Families fled from their own dying members. People who had nowhere to flee built makeshift shelters in the fields outside the city. And some, hoping that distance and the intervention of a local saint would save them, packed their belongings and walked to the nearest large city, Catania. They brought the plague with them. The people of Catania, learning that refugees from plague-stricken Messina were approaching, refused to let them enter. The refugees wandered. They tried other towns. They were refused again and again. A population of frightened, dying people moved across Sicily like a river looking for somewhere to go, and wherever they went, the disease followed. This pattern, the sick trying to flee, the healthy trying to seal their doors against them, and the disease spreading through both groups regardless, would repeat itself across Europe for the next 6 years. It was the first, and perhaps the most brutal lesson of the Black Death, that the instinct to run, to close the gates, to push the dying away, was both completely understandable and almost entirely useless. The plague did not respect borders. It did not respect city walls. It moved at the speed of human commerce and human fear, which, it turned out, were much the same speed. From Sicily, the disease followed a logic that was invisible to everyone living through it, but appears, in retrospect, almost mechanical. One strain moved south across the narrow strait to the Italian mainland, reaching the port of Reggio di Calabria within weeks. Another moved north with the Genoese ships toward their home port. The ships were refused entry to Genoa. The city had heard what was happening, or enough of it to be frightened, but some sailors managed to come ashore anyway. Genoa began to die. From Genoa, the disease moved in multiple directions simultaneously. It followed the ships westward along the French coast. On the 1st of November, 1347, a ship carrying the infection arrived at Marseille. The city had no warning, or not enough of one. The plague entered Marseille, took root, and began its march northward, up the Rhône Valley, which was, not coincidentally, the most important trade route in France. From there, the geography is a kind of terrible poetry. The Black Death moved along every road, river, and sea lane that connected the cities of Europe. By the spring of 1348, it was in Avignon, where the Pope lived. By summer, it was in Paris. By autumn, it had crossed the English Channel. By the end of 1349, it had reached Scotland and Ireland. By 1352, it was burning through what is now Russia and Ukraine. The average speed of its movement on land, in places where records are detailed enough to calculate it, was roughly 1 to 2 kilometers per day. That is not fast by any modern standard. A person walking at a moderate pace covers that distance in 15 or 20 minutes. But this slow, relentless advance, following roads, pausing inexplicably in some places, leaping forward in others, covered the entire continent in 5 years. And yet, something strange and important happened in this otherwise mechanical spread. Not everywhere died equally. Some cities and regions were struck hard, losing half or more of their populations in a matter of months. Others experienced relatively light losses. And a few, most notably the city of Milan, appeared almost untouched. The reasons for these disparities were not understood at the time and are still debated by historians today. Some had to do with geography and trade connections. Some had to do with the behaviour of local rulers. Some remained genuinely mysterious. What we know is this. By the time the first wave of the Black Death had passed through Europe, roughly from 1347 to 1353, the continent would never be the same. Its population had been reduced by somewhere between a quarter and a third. Its political structures had been shaken to their foundations. Its religious certainties had been challenged in ways that would take generations to fully absorb. And its people, the survivors, the witnesses, the chroniclers who stayed alive long enough to write down what they had seen, were left with a question that none of them could fully answer. Why? The question of why the Black Death happened, and what it meant, generated an enormous amount of writing, argument, and accusation in the years that followed. Theologians said it was God's punishment for human sin. Astrologers pointed to the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius. Physicians blamed corrupted air and diseased constitutions. And ordinary people, terrified and desperate for an explanation that felt more concrete than planetary alignment or divine will, began to look for someone they could blame. That search for a human culprit, and what it produced, belongs to later chapters of this story. But before we move forward, it is worth sitting for a moment with the people who are living through the very beginning of this catastrophe. Not the kings or the popes or the physicians who would later write learned treatises about the plague's causes. The ordinary people of Sicily and southern Italy, who in the autumn of 1347 became the first Europeans to encounter something for which they had no name, no explanation, and no defence. They knew almost immediately that they were dealing with something different. Not a famine, which killed slowly through starvation and was at least visible in the thinning of the harvests. Not a war, which came with armies and noise. This came silently, in the bodies of strangers, and it killed in days. They did what human beings do when they encounter something they cannot understand. They attached meaning to it. They called it God's punishment. They called it the foreigner's plague. They called it the work of enemies and strangers. They pointed at the Genoese ships and said, "You brought this." They pushed the sick away and said, "If we do not touch them, we will be safe." They walked to the next city and said, Surely it has not reached there yet. Almost none of this was correct. But all of it was deeply recognizably human, and in that recognition, between the terror of the 14th century and the particular terrors of our own age, lies the reason this story still matters. Chapter 2. The Symptoms, the Lies, and the Useless Doctors. Here is something that should make you deeply uncomfortable. The physicians of 14th century Europe were not stupid men. They had spent years, in many cases the better part of a decade, studying medicine at the greatest universities on the continent: Bologna, Paris, Montpellier. They had read Hippocrates and Galen. They had debated the humours of the body, the influence of the stars on human health, the proper application of bloodletting and purging. They were, by every standard available to their world, experts. And when the Black Death arrived, not one of them could do a single useful thing. Not one. They prescribed remedies that did nothing. They offered explanations that were completely wrong. Some of them charged enormous fees for treatments they knew, on some level, were worthless, and then fled when the dying got too close, taking their worthless remedies with them. Others stayed and died alongside their patients, which at least demonstrated courage, if not competence. The people who came closest to understanding how to survive the Black Death were not physicians at all. They were ordinary men and women who noticed, through raw observation, that the further you got from sick people, the better your chances became. This conclusion, obvious to us now, invisible to the medical establishment of the 14th century, was actually contradicted by the leading medical theories of the age, which held that corrupted air travelled everywhere, and that distance offered no real protection. The experts were wrong. The instincts of frightened, uneducated people were right. That is not a comfortable story. It was not a comfortable story in 1348, and it set off a crisis of authority, medical, religious, political, whose shockwaves would be felt for the next 200 years. But before we get to the crisis, we need to understand the disease itself. Because the Black Death was not one thing, it was three. And the difference between them was the difference between survival and certain death. The most common form of the plague, the one that most survivors described in their chronicles, the one that gave the Black Death its most recognizable visual vocabulary, was bubonic plague. The word bubonic comes from the Greek word for groin, because the most visible symptom was the swelling of the lymph nodes in the groin, the armpit, or the neck into hard, painful lumps that could grow to the size of an apple or even larger. These swellings, called buboes in the medical literature of the time, gavoccioli in the Italian of the survivors, were not merely unpleasant. They were agonizing, they throbbed, they darkened. In the worst cases, they burst open, releasing blood and fluid, with a smell that witnesses described as unlike anything they had encountered before. The literary giant Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence and made it the framing device for his masterwork, the Decameron, described the buboes with the clinical precision of a man who had seen them up close. Swellings the size of apples or eggs in the groin or armpit, spreading rapidly to other parts of the body, followed by dark or livid patches on the skin, and then, almost always, death. He got several details wrong: the order in which symptoms appeared, the distinction between the different forms of the disease, but his essential observation was accurate. The buboes were the calling card of the plague, and if you saw them on your own body, your chances were not good. Not zero, but not good. The Byzantine Emperor Johannes Cantacuzene, who lost one of his own sons to the plague and described the disease with unusual medical precision for a head of state, noted that some people with even the most severe symptoms recovered unexpectedly. Modern estimates, based on what we now know about the biology of Yersinia pestis and the state of 14th century immune systems, suggest that somewhere around a quarter of people infected with bubonic plague might have survived without treatment. That is not a comfortable survival rate. But it is not zero. The second form of the disease was far less forgiving. Pneumonic plague developed when the infection moved into the lungs, either progressing from untreated bubonic plague or transmitted directly from one person to another through respiratory droplets. The symptoms of pneumonic plague were different and distinctly more terrifying: high fever, severe chest pain, bloody sputum coughed up from the lungs, a darkening of the tongue and throat that witnesses described as if they had been scorched from the inside by heat. The papal physician Guy de Chauliac, one of the most eminent medical authorities in Europe, A man who had treated the Pope himself in Avignon and survived to write about it, described two distinct phases of the epidemic he witnessed. The first 2 months, dominated by continuous fever and the spitting of blood, with death in 3 days. The subsequent period dominated by the buboes and external lesions, lasting longer but still, in most cases, fatal. His description matches what we now know about the two primary forms of the disease with remarkable accuracy. But it was accuracy in description only. It told him, and the patients he was supposed to be treating, almost nothing useful about what to do. Pneumonic plague, according to every record from the period and confirmed by modern biology, was essentially always fatal. 100% mortality. If you were coughing blood, you were going to die. The only variable was how long it would take. The third form, septicemic plague, in which the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly and caused a kind of systemic poisoning, appears less frequently in the historical record, possibly because its course was so rapid that it left fewer witnesses. Septicemic plague could kill in hours. Some accounts from the period describe people who seemed perfectly healthy in the morning and were dead before sunset, with no time for the swellings or the coughing, just sudden collapse and death. This form of the disease was almost certainly misidentified by contemporaries, folded into general accounts of mysterious sudden death, and only recognizable to us now with the benefit of what we understand about bacterial sepsis. What this means, put plainly, is that the Black Death presented itself to 14th century Europeans in 3 different masks, each one more terrifying than the last. A disease that killed most of its victims over days or weeks with visible, agonizing symptoms. A disease that killed all of its victims, sometimes with alarming speed, through a pulmonary attack that must have looked indistinguishable from other respiratory illnesses, and a disease that killed some victims so quickly they seemed to drop dead without warning. No wonder people thought they were living through the end of the world. In October of 1348, roughly a year after the first ships arrived in Sicily, the medical faculty of the University of Paris produced a document that the King of France had specifically commissioned, a comprehensive expert assessment of the Black Death's causes and a guide to surviving it. This document is worth examining carefully because it represents the best medical thinking of the age, assembled by the most credentialed physicians in Europe, presented to the most powerful political authority in France. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of authoritative expert guidance that people in crisis most desperately want, and it was almost completely useless. The Paris medical faculty concluded that the primary cause of the plague was a fatal conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius, which had occurred in the year 1345. This celestial event had, according to their analysis, corrupted the air above the Earth, sending down a miasma of poisoned atmosphere that infected human bodies through breathing, through the eyes, and through contact with contaminated surfaces. Their recommended preventive measures followed logically from this diagnosis. Avoid exercise, which caused heavier breathing and thus increased exposure to the contaminated air. Avoid bathing, which opened the pores and allowed the poison to enter the body. Consume warming foods and spices. Burn aromatic herbs to purify the local atmosphere. And flee, if at all possible, to regions with cleaner air. The recommendation to flee was, accidentally, the only genuinely useful advice in the entire document, not because the air in one place was cleaner than in another, but because putting physical distance between yourself and infected people reduced your exposure to the bacteria-carrying fleas, to the respiratory droplets of pneumonic plague patients, and to the general cloud of infection that surrounded high-density dying populations. The medical faculty, in other words, gave the right advice for the completely wrong reason. Their other recommendations ranged from useless to actively harmful. Avoiding bathing, for instance, likely increased the flea burden on human bodies. Add, since fleas prefer unwashed skin and hair, though this connection between flea hygiene and disease transmission would not be understood for another 5 centuries. Burning herbs did nothing to kill bacteria, though it may have driven away some insects temporarily. The dietary recommendations were irrelevant. And bloodletting, the removal of blood through cuts or leeches, recommended as a treatment for the active disease, almost certainly killed some people who might otherwise have survived by weakening bodies already fighting for their lives. The physician Guy de Chauliac, despite being more observant than most of his contemporaries, continued to practice bloodletting and the lancing of buboes. He noted almost in passing that most of his patients died anyway. He himself contracted the plague, the bubonic form, and survived, which he attributed to his own careful regimen of treatment. It is at least as likely that he survived because a quarter of bubonic plague patients survived, and he happened to be among them. The Florentine merchant chronicler, Matteo Villani, offered perhaps the most savage assessment of the medical profession during the plague years. Physicians wandered from house to house selling their explanations, getting paid well for their services, and then demonstrating the complete worthlessness of their art by dying themselves. He noted with what reads as grim satisfaction that some of them eventually refunded the money. Against this backdrop of learned failure, a few people managed to approach something closer to the truth, though none of them got all the way there. The Muslim physician and scholar Ibn Khatima, writing in the Spanish city of Almeria, came remarkably close to a contagion theory. He argued that the disease was caused by minute living bodies that entered the human system and multiplied there. He was describing bacteria, or at least something functionally similar to bacteria, nearly 500 years before anyone had the technology to see them. His theory was not accepted by the mainstream of either Islamic or Christian medicine, which remained committed to miasma theory, but it represents perhaps the most intellectually honest attempt of the period to describe what was actually happening. The Islamic scholar Ibn al-Khatib, also writing in Spain, went further in the practical direction. He argued that the evidence of contagion was simply too obvious to deny. People who had contact with the sick got sick. People who had no contact with the sick stayed healthy. Cities that sealed their gates against outsiders survived better than those that did not. These were observable facts, and he observed them. The conclusion that the disease passed from person to person through some form of direct or close contact was correct. The mechanism remained unknown, but the behavioral implication was exactly right. Stay away from sick people, and your chances of staying healthy improved dramatically. This conclusion was also, as mentioned above, in direct contradiction to the dominant medical orthodoxy of the age. Miasma theory held that contaminated air was everywhere, inescapable, equally distributed across a region or city. If the air itself was poisoned, running from your dying neighbour was pointless. You were breathing the same poison they were. The fact that this theory was wrong did not prevent it from being the official position of every major medical institution in Europe. And official positions, as anyone who has lived through a public health crisis will recognise, have enormous influence on what authorities recommend, what individuals believe, and how policies are designed. The people who fled, who abandoned cities, who shut themselves into isolated country houses, who refused to touch or even look at the sick, were following instinct, not instruction. They were doing what scared animals do when they sense something lethal. They were running. And because they were running from a disease that required fairly close contact to transmit, running worked. The people who stayed and tried to care for the sick, the brave minority, the physicians who did not flee, the monks and nuns who continued to tend the dying in the hospitals, contracted the disease at much higher rates and died in much larger proportions. Courage, in the context of the Black Death, was often a death sentence. Here is the detail that most histories of the Black Death skip over, perhaps because it is too uncomfortable. The true cause of the plague, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas living on rats, was not discovered until the year 1894. 5.5 centuries after the Black Death swept through Europe. 5.5 centuries during which the plague returned, again and again, in waves, roughly every generation, killing more people, destroying more communities, generating more learned theories and more useless treatments. 5.5 centuries of getting it wrong. The discovery came during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong. A Swiss researcher named Alexandre Yersin isolated the bacterium responsible for the disease and identified the black rat as its primary host. 3 years later, 2 other researchers, Masanori Ogata and Paul Louis Simond, working in Bombay, identified the missing link in the transmission chain, the flea, which carried the bacteria from rats to humans. 4 nodes in the chain of death. The bacterium infects the flea infects the rat, the infected flea moves from the rat to the human, and the human dies. Or sometimes the chain was shorter, from one human to another, through respiratory droplets, in the pneumonic form. Or sometimes it was nearly instantaneous, the bacteria entering directly into the bloodstream, causing death before the body could mount any visible response. The 14th century physicians who tried to treat these 3 different diseases as if they were one thing or as if they were the result of bad air from Jupiter, were not stupid. They were working with the tools available to them within the intellectual framework of their age, without access to the microscope that would have shown them what they were actually dealing with. But their failure had consequences that went far beyond medicine. Because when the experts, the people who were supposed to know, turned out to know nothing, the question of authority became urgent. If physicians could not explain the plague, could not treat it, could not protect themselves from it, then what exactly were they for? If theologians could not explain why God would kill children who had committed no sin, then what did that say about the theology? The crisis of expertise that the Black Death created was not a brief embarrassment, it was a fracture. And into that fracture, where certainty used to be, poured something new. Doubt, questions. The radical, destabilizing idea that maybe the people who claimed to have all the answers did not, in fact, have any answers at all. That doubt would eventually become the Renaissance. It would become the Reformation. It would become the scientific revolution. But in 1348, it was not yet philosophy. It was terror. And terror, it turned out, was extraordinarily good at revealing exactly who people really were. Chapter 3. The Civilization That Broke, Florence. There is a building in Florence that most tourists walk past without stopping. It is called the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella, a Gothic church on the western edge of the old city, its white and green marble facade catching the afternoon light with a kind of serene indifference to everything that has happened around it for 7 centuries. Inside, there are frescoes by masters, chapels endowed by the greatest banking families of the medieval world, and a cloister where, in the spring of 1348, 10 young men and women gathered and made a decision. They decided to leave. Florence was dying. The bodies were piling up faster than the gravediggers could bury them. The bells that normally rang for funerals had been silenced by municipal order, because the sound had become so constant, so relentless, that city authorities feared it was driving the living insane. Doctors had stopped visiting the sick, or were charging prices so obscene that only the wealthiest could afford them, and were turning their faces away when they took the pulse of a patient, holding a cloth over their mouths, examining urine samples from a safe distance as if the glass itself might infect them. So these 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, all from wealthy families, all educated, all deeply aware that what they were doing was either an act of sensible self-preservation or an act of profound moral cowardice. Depending on who you asked, gathered at Santa Maria Novella and left the city for a comfortable villa in the countryside. There, over the course of 10 days, they told each other stories. The man who wrote down those stories was Giovanni Boccaccio. His collection, the Decameron, became one of the founding works of European literature, a monument to wit, desire, and the stubborn insistence on pleasure in the face of death. But what makes the Decameron remarkable for our purposes is not the stories themselves. It is the introduction, in which Boccaccio described what he witnessed in Florence before he left. He described a city that had been taken apart at its foundations. Not just the bodies, though there were enough bodies to fill the shock of any reader in any century, but the social fabric itself. The bonds that held human beings together in something recognizable as civilization. The willingness to care for one another. The obligation to bury the dead with dignity. The basic assumption that when someone you loved was dying, you would be there. All of it, according to Boccaccio, collapsed. And he was not the only one watching. Florence, in 1348, produced more witnesses to catastrophe than perhaps any other city in Europe, because Florence was also, at that moment, the most literate city in Europe. The merchants kept records, the humanists kept diaries, the chroniclers kept chronicles. And what they all recorded, from their different positions and with their very different agendas, adds up to something extraordinary. A portrait of a civilization in the act of discovering its own worst self. The most reliable account of the Florence plague, the one that historians tend to trust most, because its author had the most professional reason to be accurate, came from a wholesale merchant named Matteo Villani. Matteo was the younger brother of Giovanni Villani, a fellow merchant who had been writing a chronicle of Florence for decades. Giovanni's chronicle stopped mid-sentence in early 1348. He was one of the plague's early victims, dead before he could describe the catastrophe that was unfolding around him. Matteo, who survived, picked up the chronicle where his brother left off, partly out of brotherly duty, partly out of the very human need to impose some narrative shape on an experience that otherwise felt like pure chaos. What Matteo brought to the chronicle was a merchant's discipline. Merchants, as he understood very well, had to be careful with information. They had to distinguish between rumour and fact, between useful data and emotional noise. They had to quantify things, and when they could not quantify them precisely, they had to acknowledge the uncertainty rather than paper over it with false confidence. So Matteo Villani is the chronicler who, unusually, told his readers when he did not know something. He dismissed the astrological explanation for the plague, the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius, with a businessman's pragmatism. Similar planetary conjunctions had occurred many times before, without producing any catastrophe, so the connection was simply not credible. He rejected this without offering an alternative, because he had no alternative to offer. He simply did not know what had caused the plague, and he said so. What he did know, what he could observe and record, was the pattern of social breakdown in Florence during the peak months of the epidemic, roughly from April through September of 1348. His most damning observation was about human care, or its absence. Because people believed, correctly, it turned out, though for the wrong reasons, that the disease was somehow transmitted through eye contact or physical proximity with the sick. Many people abandoned their closest relatives the moment symptoms appeared. Matteo described this not with outrage, but with the flat affect of a man recording a business transaction. They left. The sick died without care who might have survived with it. But he also recorded the opposite, the minority of people who stayed, who cared for the sick, and who in many cases survived themselves. His conclusion was theological. God was testing humanity, and those who showed courage would be rewarded with survival, while those who fled in selfishness would be struck down regardless. This is not a conclusion we would reach today, but the underlying observation was accurate. People who cared for plague victims did not always die. Some of them survived, and their survival, for whatever biological reason, encouraged others to stay and help. The economic aftermath of the plague was Matteo's other great subject. He watched with the precise attention of a man who understood markets as prices went insane. Services that had been common before the plague became luxuries overnight. Workers who had survived demanded wages that would have been unthinkable in 1347. The survivors, suddenly inheriting wealth from dead relatives, found themselves rich without having done anything to earn it. And instead of becoming better people, which is what Matteo and everyone else who had lived through the horror expected would happen, they became worse. They spent the inherited money on food and clothes and pleasures. They gambled. They fornicated. They dressed in ways that violated every sumptuary law the city had on the books. The moral purification that the plague was supposed to produce, the chastening of human greed and pride in the face of divine judgment, simply did not occur. Matteo Villani would live long enough to watch the plague return to Florence in 1363. He died in that second wave at roughly 70 years of age, having spent the last 15 years of his life watching his city fail to learn the lesson he believed God was trying to teach it. He never stopped believing the lesson was there to be learned. If Matteo Villani approached the Florence plague with a merchant's careful sobriety, the man known as Marchione di Coppo Stefani approached it with something closer to a scream. Marchione was 12 years old when the first wave of the Black Death hit Florence in 1348. He did not write his chronicle of those events until 30 years later, looking back across 3 decades at a city he believed had been permanently, irreversibly corrupted by what it had lived through. His account is one of the most viscerally powerful documents of the plague era, and one of the most obviously personal, in the way that only a man with a very specific political grievance can be personal, while claiming to speak for the public good. What Marchione saw in the plague was not God's judgment, or not primarily that. What he saw was the destruction of the social order he had grown up in, and its replacement by people he considered unworthy. His description of Florence at the height of the epidemic is worth sitting with, because it describes something that every subsequent account of catastrophic social breakdown from every century will recognize as true. Children abandoned their fathers, husbands abandoned their wives abandoned their husbands. Siblings fled from each other. The doctors who had not already escaped demanded payment in advance, turned their faces aside when examining patients, and left as quickly as possible. The priests who were supposed to offer the last rites, the final religious comfort available to a dying medieval Christian, the assurance that the soul would not go to judgment without proper preparation, attended only the wealthy and charged accordingly. The municipal government eventually had to issue regulations limiting how many clergy could attend a single wealthy household, because the scramble for deathbed fees had become so unseemly and so obviously corrupted that it threatened to make the church look worse than it already did. Marcion recorded prices. He recorded them with the obsessive detail of a man who understood that economic dislocation is a form of social injury. The cost of a burial shroud went from 3 florins to 100 florins. Eggs sold for 12 to 24 denarii each. Gravediggers earned so much money that many of them became, in the span of a few months, substantially wealthy. Pharmacists, herbalists, and coffin makers all profited enormously. The city that had been built on the disciplined accumulation of wealth through legitimate trade was now generating fortunes for anyone willing to touch the dead. And then the plague ended. What happened next was, in Marcion's telling, the final insult. The survivors, particularly those who had inherited wealth from dead relatives, or who had seized opportunities created by the chaos to accumulate money they had no claim to, began moving into the empty palaces, wearing the clothes of the dead, filling positions in the government, and the guilds that had previously been held by families with generations of standing in the city. Marcion called these people the new rich. He described them with contempt that has not faded in 7 centuries. They were crude, they were shameless, they did not know how to behave. They had no respect for the traditions and the hierarchies that had made Florence what it was. And now, because so many of the people who embodied those traditions and hierarchies were dead, there was no one left with the standing to stop them. This is where Marcion's account reveals something important about how catastrophe works. Something that goes beyond the specific details of 14th century Florence and touches on a more general truth about human societies. Major catastrophes do not, as a rule, produce the moral improvement that survivors hope for. They produce instead an acceleration of whatever tendencies were already present before the disaster struck. The generous become more generous, the selfish become more selfish, the ambitious become more ambitious, the resentful become more resentful. And the people with power before the catastrophe, not always, but more often than not, find ways to maintain and even extend that power in the aftermath, using the emergency as a justification for measures they would have wanted to take anyway. Marcion, who belonged to the middle stratum of Florentine society, not the great banking families, not the labouring poor, but the comfortable middle layer of merchants and guild members who had benefited from the old order and depended on its stability, watched this process with the helpless fury of a man who understood exactly what was happening, but could not stop it. The plague, as he saw it, had not created a new and better Florence. It had destroyed the old Florence and replaced it with something coarser, more corrupt, and more unjust. The wrong people had survived. The wrong people had gotten rich, and the city would never be the same. He was not entirely wrong, but he was also not entirely right, because what was happening in Florence in the years after 1348 was more complicated than a simple story of corruption and decline. It was a restructuring, brutal, chaotic, often unjust, of a society that had been under enormous strain long before the plague arrived. The storyteller who chose pleasure over despair. Against the merchant's sobriety and the middle-class man's fury, Giovanni Boccaccio chose a third response to the same catastrophe: art. Boccaccio was 34 years old when the plague arrived in Florence. He was the illegitimate son of a wealthy merchant, well-educated, already known in literary circles for his earlier works. He had connections, means, and the kind of social flexibility that came with being genuinely talented in a city that valued talent. He was also, by his own account, absolutely terrified by what he witnessed in the spring of 1348. His description of Florence at the height of the plague, the introduction to the Decameron, is the most famous literary account of the Black Death, and it earned that status legitimately. It is precise in its horror, unflinching in its honesty about human behaviour, and structured with an artistry that transforms raw catastrophe into something that can be read, processed, and in some complicated sense, survived. He described the disease with the attention of a man determined to bear accurate witness. The swellings in the groin and armpit, the dark patches spreading across the skin, the rapidity of death that reduced the interval between the appearance of symptoms and the end to a matter of days or even hours. He described the social collapse, the abandonment of the sick, the disappearance of basic rituals of mourning, the bodies left in the streets for lack of anyone to carry them. He described the diversity of human responses, those who retreated into prayer and fasting, those who retreated into pleasure and excess, those who fled the city entirely, and the small minority who stayed and tried to care for the dying. He placed himself, implicitly, in the last category, though the 10 young people of his framing narrative were fleeing, not staying. This is the tension at the heart of the Decameron, and it is a tension that Boccaccio never quite resolved. His fictional protagonists escape the city and spend 10 days telling witty, sensual, sometimes scandalous stories in a beautiful villa in the hills. The stories are funny. They celebrate cleverness, desire, and the pleasures of being alive. They are, in their way, an act of defiance, a refusal to let horror be the last word. But in writing them, Boccaccio was not actually escaping the plague. He was processing it. He was using the only tool available to him, narrative, language, art, to make something comprehensible out of an experience that resisted comprehension. The stories are not escapism. They are the form that survival took for a man whose primary instrument was the imagination. And in doing so, Boccaccio stumbled onto something that the merchants and the chroniclers and the physicians all missed. The idea that the plague, for all its horror, might be the occasion for a new kind of human expression. Something freer, more direct, less constrained by the pieties and conventions of the world that the dying had carried away with them. That intuition, that catastrophe, if survived, can become the raw material of transformation, would take generations to fully articulate. But it began, arguably, in a villa in the Tuscan hills, where 10 frightened young people told each other stories while Florence burned. By the end of 1348, Florence had lost somewhere between a third and a half of its population. The exact number will never be known. The dead were too numerous, the record-keeping too disrupted, the estimates too coloured by the agendas of the people making them. What is known is this: the city that emerged from the plague was not the same city that the plague had entered. The great banking houses, the Peruzzi, the Bardi, the trading companies that had lent money to kings and financed the wool trade across Europe, had already been weakening before the plague arrived. Caught in the collapse of overextended credit, the plague finished what the financial crisis had started. Old families disappeared, old certainties dissolved. The social architecture of the city, the web of guilds, kinship networks, political factions, and commercial alliances that had given Florence its particular character, was cracked through with new fractures. Into those fractures new things grew. Some of them were ugly. The opportunism, the profiteering, the shameless accumulation that Marcion chronicled with such outrage. Some of them were ambiguous. The new political configurations, the shift in power toward families and individuals who had not previously held it, the disruption of the old hierarchies. And some of them were, in the long arc of history, genuinely extraordinary. The humanism, the art, the literature, the slow revolution in how educated Europeans thought about human beings and their place in the world. None of those extraordinary things were visible in the summer of 1348, when the gravediggers were piling bodies in trenches near the Arno River, stacking them layer by layer with dirt between them, like lasagna, as Marcion wrote, in the darkest simile in all of medieval literature. At that moment, there was only the dying, only the smell, only the question, repeated in every surviving document from that summer, the same question in Italian and Latin and French and German and Arabic. Why? The answer would take centuries, and it would not look like anything anyone expected. Chapter 4. 5 Cities, 5 Fates. Here is a question that no one in 14th century Europe could answer, and that historians are still arguing about today. Why did some cities die and others survive? Florence lost between a third and a half of its population. Siena lost so many people that a construction project, the expansion of its cathedral into what would have been the largest Gothic church in the world, was simply abandoned mid-build, the half-finished walls left standing as a monument to interrupted ambition. Paris lost perhaps a third of its citizens. Avignon, where the Pope lived, was devastated so severely that the Pope himself spent months sitting between two enormous fires, refusing to let anyone approach him, essentially sealing himself into a private quarantine within his own palace. And Milan, one of the largest cities in Europe, sitting at the crossroads of the most important trade routes in northern Italy, a city that by all logic should have been among the most vulnerable, lost almost no one. Almost no one. This is not a rounding error. This is not a statistical anomaly that can be explained away. This is a genuine mystery, and it sits at the heart of one of the most consequential political arguments of the 14th century. An argument about power, authority, and what kind of leadership a civilization under existential threat actually needs. The answer that Milan's survival pointed toward was not comfortable for anyone who believed in democracy, collective governance, or the idea that political legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed. But it was an answer that shaped the next 2 centuries of European political history in ways that are still visible today. To understand it, we need to travel. Not in space exactly, but in the particular quality of catastrophe. Because every city that encountered the Black Death encountered it differently, filtered it through its own politics and economics and social structure, and produced from that encounter a story that was entirely its own. 5 cities, 5 fates, and somewhere in the comparison, a truth about what disasters reveal about the societies they strike. Rome, the city that was already ruins. Rome in 1348 was not the Rome of the Caesars, or even the Rome of the great medieval popes. It was a depleted, half-abandoned city of perhaps 20,000 people, its ancient monuments crumbling, its streets unpaved, its political life dominated by the violent feuds of aristocratic families, the Colonna, the Orsini, the Savelli, who treated the city as a prize to be seized rather than a community to be governed. 2pt. KS. The papacy had left Rome more than 40 years earlier, relocating to Avignon in southern France, and in the absence of the institutional anchor that the Church provided, Rome had decayed into something closer to a collection of fortified family compounds than a functioning city. The ancient Forum was used as a cow pasture. Travellers who came to see the great ruins of antiquity described a landscape of desolation that seemed to belong more to the past than the present. Into this already diminished world, the plague arrived in the spring of 1348, and it found a city that was simultaneously too weak and too fragmented to organise any coherent response. What Rome had, instead of effective governance, was a remarkable man named Cola di Rienzo. Cola was a notary by training, the son of a tavern keeper, entirely self-educated in the classical literature that the ruins of Rome suggested had once made this city the centre of the world. He had spent years reading Cicero and Livy, studying the inscriptions on ancient monuments, developing an increasingly grandiose vision of Rome restored to its ancient glory, and himself as the instrument of that restoration. In the spring of 1347, a year before the plague arrived, Cola launched what amounted to a coup. He organised the artisans and the common people of Rome against the feuding aristocratic families, dressed himself in elaborate ceremonial armour, and declared himself Tribune of Rome, resurrecting a title from the ancient republic that had been dormant for more than 1,000 years. For a few extraordinary months it worked. The aristocratic families fled or submitted. Cola issued decrees. He convened assemblies. He sent letters to other Italian cities proposing a federation of Italian republics. He had himself crowned with a laurel wreath in a ceremony of absurd, magnificent excess, taking communion from 7 golden chalices to symbolize the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, and then spending 2 days in a ceremonial bath that he said was the same bath that the Emperor Constantine had used. He was, depending on your perspective, either a visionary or a lunatic, probably both. The plague did not arrive in Rome until after Cola's brief experiment in republican government had already collapsed, brought down by his own increasingly erratic behaviour, the return of the aristocrats, and the fundamental impossibility of rebuilding a functioning political community on the basis of one man's classical fantasies. By the time the dying began in Rome, Cola had already fled. What the plague found in Rome was therefore a city without leadership of any coherent kind, neither the aristocratic governance that the plague had disrupted in Florence, nor the strong personal rule that would prove so effective in Milan. It found a city already in ruins, spiritually and literally, and it simply added to the ruins. The Roman chronicle of the plague is thinner than the Florentine one, partly because Rome had fewer literate witnesses, and partly because what happened in Rome during those months was less politically interesting than what happened elsewhere. People died. The city survived. And when Cola di Rienzo eventually returned to Rome, years later, under different auspices, he was murdered by a mob. His body hung upside down from a balcony and then burned. Even in catastrophe, Rome managed to be theatrical. 60 kilometres north of plague-ravaged Piacenza, where the chronicler Gabriele de Mussis was watching his city die and composing his famous account of the plague's origins, sat Milan. Milan in the 1340s was one of the largest cities in Europe, with a population that most estimates place at over 150,000. It was wealthy, commercially active, and positioned at the intersection of the Alpine trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to northern Europe. By every epidemiological logic available to us now, it should have been among the first and most severely affected cities on the continent. It was not. The accounts from surrounding cities, from the Sienese chronicler Agnolo di Tura, from the Pisan and Florentine chroniclers, from virtually every source that mentions Milan in this period, are consistent in their bafflement. 3 families died. Their houses were sealed. Almost no one else died. While every other great city in Italy was losing between a third and a half of its population, Milan emerged from the first wave of the Black Death with losses so minimal that other chroniclers, searching for an explanation, simply could not find one convincing enough to commit to. The man responsible was Luchino Visconti, the ruler of Milan. Luchino was not a man who invited admiration. Even the sources that credit him with saving Milan describe him in terms that make it clear they would have preferred a different saviour. He was suspicious, ruthless, and almost entirely without the qualities that medieval political theorists associated with legitimate rule, dynastic tradition, divine sanction, the long history of recognised authority. He had seized power by force, maintained it by force, and extended it by eliminating anyone who posed a threat, including members of his own family. He was, in the vocabulary of the time, a tyrant, and in the crisis of 1348, his tyranny may have saved 150,000 lives. What Luchino did, based on the fragmentary accounts that survive, supplemented by later descriptions of the measures his successors continued to use, was essentially this: he sealed Milan. He stopped allowing people from infected regions to enter the city, controlling the movement of goods and the merchants who carried them with an attention to detail that went far beyond anything attempted elsewhere. When individual cases of plague appeared within the city, and some did appear, the infected households were sealed. Not quarantined in the modern sense, where the sick are isolated but the healthy are allowed to leave. Sealed, completely. The doors and windows bricked shut. No one in, no one out. The people inside these sealed houses died, if they were infected. Some of the healthy people sealed in with them may have died too, but the disease did not spread from those houses to the rest of the city. Whether Luchino actually used this most extreme measure, bricking people alive into their homes, is not entirely certain. The sources are thin, and those thin sources are complicated by the political agendas of the people who wrote them. The chroniclers who should have been most interested in documenting Milan's extraordinary success, the Milanese chroniclers themselves, were largely silent on the subject, either because they found the methods too disturbing to describe, or because praising the tyrant's effectiveness would have required praising the tyrant. What is certain is the result. Milan survived. The death toll that devastated every other major Italian city passed over Milan with almost miraculous lightness. And that miracle, or rather, that achievement, because it was an achievement, not a miracle, would echo through European political thought for the next 2 centuries. The lesson that observers drew from Milan's survival was not comfortable, but it was hard to argue with. Strong, centralized, ruthless authority, wielded by a single person, unconstrained by the need to build consensus or respect traditional limits, had protected its people in a way that no republic, no committee, no deliberative body had managed to do. This was not the lesson that the humanists of Florence wanted to hear. It was not the lesson that the merchants of Venice or the guild members of the Rhineland cities wanted to hear. But it was the lesson that the 14th century wrote in blood, and it would be read and acted upon by rulers and political theorists for generations to come. Even in 2020, as Italy struggled with a new pandemic, voices in Milan and beyond invoked the memory of Luchino Visconti. "Give us a second Visconti," some said. If only we had had him in January and February. Catastrophe has a long memory, and so does the argument it makes for strong hands. Venice was, in 1348, arguably the most sophisticated governing machine in Europe. The Venetian Republic had been developing its political institutions for centuries, refining a system of checks and balances, overlapping councils, and carefully managed elections that prevented any single individual or family from accumulating the kind of power that Milan's Visconti had seized. The Great Council, the body that held ultimate authority in the Republic, had hundreds of members. Decisions were made collectively. Power was distributed, rotated, and constrained by layers of institutional oversight that the Venetians considered the foundation of their freedom and their prosperity. When the plague arrived in Venice in March of 1348, this sophisticated governing machine did something that would have surprised no one who has watched sophisticated governing machines encounter genuine emergencies. It panicked, and then it overreacted. The first major measure, issued on the 3rd of April, barely a month after the disease appeared, ordered that all plague patients in the city's hospitals, all infected homeless people, all infected poor people who could not afford their own burial, and all family members who wished to accompany dying relatives be transported to remote islands in the lagoon. Read that again. Family members who wished to accompany their dying relatives were transported to islands. This was not quarantine in any meaningful medical sense. It was removal. The city's aristocratic leadership had identified the disease as originating in the poor, overcrowded neighbourhoods, which was not entirely wrong, given that high-density living genuinely did increase transmission, and had decided that the solution was to get the poor out of sight. The result was a system that functioned primarily as a way to clean the streets of Venice of its most visibly suffering inhabitants, while doing relatively little to actually contain the spread of disease among the wealthy neighbourhoods where the decisions were being made. June brought a second major decree. Plague patients were now forbidden from entering the city at all, under threat of severe punishment. This was applied months after the disease was already firmly established inside the city walls, an act of institutional closure of the stable door that would be recognisable to any observer of crisis management in any century. But Venice's most significant plague-related event was not a public health measure at all. It was a political conspiracy. In the autumn of 1348, as the plague was still burning through the city, a Venetian nobleman named Marin Faglia began organising what amounted to a coup against the Republican government. Faglia was the Doge, the elected head of state, the face of Venetian power, but the Doge in Venice was a ceremonial position, constrained on all sides by the councils and committees that held real authority. Faglia wanted more. He wanted to be what Luchino Visconti was in Milan, an actual ruler with actual power, accountable to no one. His plan was to use the social disruption of the plague, the weakening of institutions, the fear, the desperate hunger for strong leadership that catastrophe reliably produces, as the moment to overthrow the aristocratic republic and install himself as a prince. It failed. His co-conspirators were identified. Faglia was arrested, tried, and beheaded in the courtyard of the ducal palace, the same courtyard where new doges were normally presented to the public. The portrait of Faglia in the great council chamber, where the portraits of all doges were displayed, was covered with a black curtain. It remains covered to this day. Venice survived the coup attempt and survived the plague, though it lost perhaps a third of its population. And the lesson Venice drew from Faglia's conspiracy was almost the precise opposite of the lesson that the rest of Italy drew from Milan's survival. That the tyrannical impulse, the desire to concentrate power in a single person during a crisis, was the greatest internal threat a free republic faced, and that the institutions of collective governance, however awkward and slow, were worth defending even in the middle of a catastrophe. Venice would remain a republic for another 4.5 centuries. Avignon, in 1348, was the most important city in the Christian world. The papacy had moved there from Rome in 1309, establishing a new court on the banks of the Rhone River that was simultaneously the spiritual centre of European Christianity and one of the most politically fraught institutions in the Western world. The popes of Avignon, the so-called Babylonian captivity of the Church, as their critics called it, were closely associated with the French crown, deeply embedded in the politics of southern France, and under constant pressure from the Italian cities and the Holy Roman Emperor, who wanted the papacy back in Rome, where they felt it belonged. The Pope in 1348 was Clement VI, a man of considerable political sophistication, genuine intellectual curiosity, and a lifestyle of such conspicuous luxury that his critics found it difficult to reconcile with the message of the gospel. He had a taste for fine food, beautiful buildings, and the company of educated people. He was also, by the standards of his age, unusually rational in his approach to crisis. When the plague arrived in Avignon in March of 1348, Clement did several things that distinguished him from most rulers of his time. He consulted his physician, Guy de Chauliac, and followed the medical advice he received, including the advice to sit between two large fires, which was intended to purify the air around him but functioned, inadvertently, as a kind of barrier against the flea-bearing rats that carried the disease. He issued bulls, papal pronouncements, ordering that the Jews of Europe not be persecuted for causing the plague, since there was no evidence they had done so. He consecrated the Rhone River so that plague victims could be buried in it when the cemeteries ran out of space, a practical solution to a practical problem that required a creative theological justification, and he survived. His survival was partly luck, partly the isolation that his wealth and status allowed him to maintain, but it also reflected something genuine about Clement's character, a willingness to act on available evidence rather than ideology, to make practical decisions under pressure, and to resist the popular demand for scapegoats even when providing scapegoats would have been politically easier. His physician Guy de Chauliac was less lucky or less protected. De Chauliac contracted the bubonic form of the plague and survived, which he attributed to his own medical regimen, though, as we have already noted, a quarter of bubonic plague patients survived regardless of treatment. His survival gave him something rare among plague-era writers, the authority of direct experience. Around Avignon, as across all of Europe, the dying continued. Paris encountered the plague in September of 1348, later than the Italian cities and later than Avignon. By this point, the disease had been moving through Europe for nearly a year, and the word of what it did had preceded it. Paris knew what was coming. It simply could not stop it. What Paris did in response was characteristically French. It commissioned a report. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, the most prestigious medical institution in Europe, produced a comprehensive written assessment of the plague's causes and recommended countermeasures, presented to the King of France in October of 1348. We have already discussed the contents of this document, the planetary conjunctions, the corrupted air, the advice to avoid bathing and exercise. But the document's existence tells us something important, beyond its contents. The King of France needed the report because he needed the plague to be someone else's problem. Not God's punishment of France specifically, that would imply something terrible about the French king's relationship with God. Not the result of any failure of governance, that would imply the king was responsible. The planetary explanation was ideal precisely because it removed human agency from the equation entirely. Jupiter and Saturn had done this. No one was at fault. The king could mourn his dead subjects without accepting any responsibility for their deaths. This is not a uniquely medieval response to catastrophe. It is a timeless one. The Parisian account of the plague, the one attributed to a Carmelite monk, possibly named Jean de Venette, though the authorship is disputed, is notable for being almost the only account from the period that describes the plague in terms that are not primarily about horror, moral collapse, and social breakdown. The monk described people dying peacefully, reconciled to God, cared for by brave nurses and clergy. He described the post-plague baby boom, the surge in births that followed the killing, as surviving populations rushed to replenish what had been lost. He described hope. He was probably not entirely accurate, but his account reflects something real about Paris that distinguishes it from the Italian accounts. A society that was, despite the catastrophe, more institutionally cohesive, more willing to absorb the blow collectively rather than shattering into individual acts of abandonment and self-preservation. Or perhaps the Parisian sources simply recorded less of the ugliness. Historical memory is always, to some degree, a choice about what to remember. 5 cities, 5 different stories, and yet, looking across them, a pattern begins to emerge. The cities that fared best, both in terms of raw mortality and in terms of institutional survival, were the cities where someone with actual authority made actual decisions quickly. Milan, under Visconti's iron governance, lost almost no one. Venice, despite its initial panic and its aristocratic tendency toward protecting the wealthy at the expense of the poor, maintained enough institutional coherence to survive both the plague and the coup attempt that followed it. The cities that suffered most were the ones where authority was fragmented, contested, or absent, where the crisis arrived into a political vacuum that no one had the power to fill. Florence, for all its wealth and cultural sophistication, had no effective central authority in 1348. Its merchant republic was governed by committee, by faction, by the endless negotiation of competing family interests. When the plague arrived, there was no one with the power to do what Luchino Visconti did in Milan, to seal the city, control the movement of people, enforce quarantine with the ruthlessness that effective quarantine requires. This is an uncomfortable observation for anyone who values democratic governance and republican institutions. But the 14th century was not interested in comfortable observations. It was interested in survival, and the lesson it wrote, in the bodies of the dead, was that concentrated authority responded faster, acted more decisively, and protected more people than any form of distributed governance managed to do. Whether that lesson was true in any general sense, whether the Milanese miracle was really the result of Visconti's governance, or partly luck, or partly some other factor entirely, is a question historians are still arguing, but the lesson was believed, and that belief had consequences that shaped European political development for the next 2 centuries. The plague did not just kill people, it ran an experiment across dozens of cities simultaneously in what different forms of governance looked like under maximum pressure, and the results of that experiment, ambiguous, messy, resistant to simple interpretation, but impossible to ignore, fed directly into the political theory and political practice of the Renaissance and the early modern period. The question the Black Death posed to every European city was simple: who is in charge here? And the answer that question produced would determine not just who survived the plague, but what Europe would become afterward. Chapter 5. The Scapegoats, Massacre, Flagellants, and the Darkness of the Human Heart. There is a moment in every catastrophe when fear stops looking inward and starts looking outward, when the dying has gone on long enough, when the prayers have not worked, and the doctors have not worked, and the city gates have not worked, when the explanations offered by the people who are supposed to have explanations have proven hollow. At that moment, something shifts. The question stops being, why is this happening, and becomes, who is doing this to us? It is one of the oldest movements in human psychology, and in the 14th century it produced one of the most systematic campaigns of mass murder in European history before the 20th century. The victims were the Jews of Europe. What happened to Jewish communities across the Rhineland, across the cities of Germany and Switzerland and France, during the plague years of 1348 and 1349 was not spontaneous. It was not simply the eruption of mob violence, the uncontrollable fury of frightened people lashing out. It was organised. It was planned. It was, in many cases, carried out with the explicit or tacit approval of local political and ecclesiastical authorities who understood exactly what they were permitting and chose to permit it anyway. It was also, in a historical irony of the darkest kind, frequently carried out before the plague had even arrived in the cities where it occurred. People were massacred as a preventive measure. The disease had not yet appeared, but the accusation had, and the accusation was sufficient. To understand how this happened, we need to understand the world that made it possible, because the persecution of Jews during the Black Death did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a society that had been building the structures of hatred for centuries, and the plague merely provided the occasion to use them. The specific accusation against Jews during the plague years was poisoning. Jews, it was said, were deliberately contaminating the wells and water sources of Christian communities with a substance, sometimes described as a powder, sometimes as a liquid, sometimes as a combination of plague-infected materials that caused the Black Death. The poison was being manufactured and distributed through a network of Jewish communities across Europe, coordinated by Jewish leaders, financed by Jewish wealth, and motivated by an ancient hatred of Christianity. None of this was true. None of it had any basis in evidence. The plague killed Jews at rates similar to, or sometimes higher than those at which it killed Christians, a fact that should have been immediately obvious to anyone looking at the actual mortality patterns in cities with Jewish populations. Jews drew water from the same sources as Christians, lived in the same neighbourhoods in many cases, and died in the same proportions. They had no more protection against Yersinia pestis than anyone else. But the accusation did not need to be true. It needed to be useful. And it was extraordinarily useful to a great many people, for a great many different reasons. For the frightened common people of European cities, the poisoning theory provided what the plague had otherwise denied them: a human cause with a human solution. God's punishment could not be stopped. Corrupted air from planetary conjunctions could not be stopped. But a Jewish conspiracy could be stopped. You could find the conspirators. You could punish them. You could, at least in fantasy, exercise some control over the catastrophe that had made you feel completely powerless. For the indebted nobles and merchants who owed money to Jewish lenders, the accusation provided something more concrete: the possibility of eliminating their creditors and their debts simultaneously. The property of massacred Jews did not disappear. It was seized by cities, by local lords, by the church, by the neighbours who had watched the burning and were now helping themselves to what remained. And for the political authorities who needed to demonstrate their effectiveness in the face of a crisis they could not actually manage, permitting or organising violence against Jews was a way of showing that they were doing something, that they were in control, that the disaster had a cause and the cause was being addressed. The Emperor Charles IV, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, actually issued advance pardons to cities that attacked their Jewish populations before the violence had even begun in those cities. He granted rights to the property of dead Jews to local nobles before those Jews had been killed. This was not a failure of governance. It was governance of a particularly cynical kind, the deliberate engineering of violence for political and financial benefit, wrapped in the language of public health and divine justice. In the German city of Würzburg, the massacre of the Jewish community in 1349 offers one of the most chilling illustrations of how the accusation worked in practice. The chronicle account is written by a cathedral scholar named Michael de Leon, and it is worth examining because it displays, with almost clinical clarity, the complete architecture of the accusation, how it arrived, how it was processed, and what it justified. The Jews of Würzburg, Michael de Leon wrote, had been poisoning wells in France and Germany. This information came from other cities, reports of Jewish confessions, extracted under torture in places like Basel and Freiburg, which detailed the conspiracy in vivid and consistent detail. The consistency of these confessions was taken as evidence of their truth. It was not considered, or at least not recorded as having been considered, that people being tortured will say whatever their torturers want to hear, and that the consistency of confessions extracted by the same interrogators using the same methods proves nothing except the effectiveness of the torture. The Jewish community of Würzburg was brought before a secular court, found guilty, sentenced to death. They burned their own houses, the chronicle reports, and died in the flames with their property. And then the chronicle notes, with a satisfaction that has not faded in 7 centuries, the Jews were thus almost entirely destroyed throughout Germany. What Michael de Leon did not note, what the chronicle carefully omits, is that the plague had not yet arrived in Würzburg when the massacre occurred. The Jewish community was destroyed as a preventive measure. The poisoning had been reported elsewhere. The evidence had arrived before the disease. And that evidence, extracted under torture, transmitted through a network of frightened cities looking for a solution they could act on, was sufficient to justify killing everyone. 2 months after the massacre, Emperor Charles IV transferred all the property of the murdered Jews to the city and the cathedral. A new market square was built on the site of the former Jewish quarter. A chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary was erected there. The city had purified itself. The plague arrived anyway. The events in Strasbourg in 1348 and 1349 are more complex than Würzburg, and in their complexity, they reveal something important about how these persecutions worked at the level of local politics. The chronicle account from this region was written by Matthias von Neuenburg, a cathedral scholar whose description of the plague is notably brief. He dispatched the medical facts in a few sentences before turning to what he clearly considered the real story: the persecution of Jews and the political struggle surrounding it. In Strasbourg, the decision about what to do with the Jewish community was not made quickly or without opposition. The city council initially resisted the pressure to act. This resistance came not from humanitarian concern, but from a more practical consideration. The wealthy citizens of Strasbourg, the merchants, the bankers, the people who had the most financial dealings with Jewish lenders, recognized that destroying the Jewish community would disrupt the credit networks on which the city's commercial life depended. This was not a principled defense of innocent people. It was a calculation about economic self-interest. But it was enough, briefly, to create a standoff. The standoff was broken by an alliance between the rural nobility, who owed money to Jewish creditors and wanted those debts erased, and the urban guilds, whose members viewed the Jewish merchants and traders as commercial competitors they would be happy to eliminate. Together, these two groups overthrew the city council that had been resisting. They installed a new government, and the new government acted. On the 14th of February, 1349, St. Valentine's Day, the Jewish community of Strasbourg, numbering perhaps 2,000 people, was led to the Jewish cemetery outside the city walls. They were given a choice: convert to Christianity or burn. Most of them burned. The Chronicle of Matthias von Neuenburg describes this with a combination of the matter of fact and the extraordinary that is itself a document of how thoroughly normalized such violence had become. He noted that the Jews were burned. He noted that their children who had not yet been baptized were taken away to be raised as Christians. He noted that the debts owed to the dead Jews were cancelled. He noted that the property was distributed. And then the chronicle moves on. What it does not record is that the Pope, Clement VI, the same Pope who was sitting between his two fires in Avignon, had issued two formal bulls ordering that the Jews be protected, that the accusations against them were false, and that Christians who attacked Jews were sinning against God and man alike. Clement had even pointed out the obvious, that Jews were dying of the plague too, in the same proportions as Christians, which made the poisoning accusations simply implausible. None of this made any difference in Strasbourg, or in Frankfurt, or in Mainz, or in dozens of other German cities where Jewish communities were attacked, burned, or driven out during the plague years. The papal authority that was supposed to be the supreme moral voice of Christian civilization found itself entirely unable to stop the violence its own people were committing. And that impotence, the inability of the Church's highest authority to enforce its own moral prohibitions when those prohibitions conflicted with the economic interests and psychological needs of the people below, was itself a kind of plague, a plague of moral authority that would prove, in the long run, as destructive as the bacterium. Alongside the violence against Jews, sometimes preceding it, sometimes following it, sometimes occurring simultaneously, another movement swept through Germany and the Low Countries during the plague years that was, in its own way, equally extreme and equally revealing about what mass catastrophe does to human psychology. These were the Flagellants. The movement had existed before the Black Death, in smaller and more localized forms, groups of penitents who believed that physical suffering was a form of prayer, that by inflicting pain on their own bodies they could atone for sin and move God to mercy. But the plague transformed this marginal practice into a mass phenomenon that terrified the church authorities almost as much as it frightened ordinary observers. The flagellant processions that moved through German and Dutch cities in 1348 and 1349 followed a consistent ritual. Groups of men, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, marched in procession, stripped to the waist, singing hymns and beating themselves with leather whips embedded with iron spikes. They marched from city to city, holding public ceremonies in which they fell to the ground in prescribed postures, symbolizing the positions of those who had died in sin, and then rose and flogged themselves again. The blood was real, the pain was real, and the crowds that gathered to watch and sometimes to join were enormous. The flagellant movement was not simply self-destructive theatre, it had a theology. The Flagellants believed that 33.5 days of this practice, corresponding to the years of Christ's life, would wash away all sin and guarantee the practitioner's salvation. They were offering in effect a do-it-yourself route to eternal life, bypassing the institutional church and its sacraments entirely. You did not need a priest. You did not need confession. You did not need the elaborate system of penitential practice and indulgences that the church had spent centuries constructing. You needed 33.5 days and a whip with iron spikes. For this reason, among others, the church eventually condemned the movement and ordered its suppression. The Pope issued a bull against the Flagellants. in October of 1349, and the Emperor Charles IV cooperated in enforcing it. But there was another reason the Flagellants frightened the authorities, beyond their theological independence. Wherever the flagellant processions went, violence against Jews tended to follow. The connection was not incidental. The Flagellants carried with them, from city to city, the accusation, the story of the Jewish conspiracy, the poisoning, the well contamination. They brought it as part of their repertoire of apocalyptic belief, and wherever they performed their bloody ceremonies, local populations were primed to act on what they had heard. The movement collapsed relatively quickly once the papal condemnation was enforced, but the communities it had helped to destroy did not come back. The Jewish neighbourhoods of dozens of German cities, centuries old, integrated into the commercial and intellectual life of those cities in ways that would take generations to fully understand, were gone. The people who had lived in them were dead or scattered, and the property that had belonged to them had been redistributed to people who had no intention of giving it back. Here is what the massacres and the flagellant processions, taken together, tell us about 14th century European society and about human societies generally. When an explanation for catastrophe is offered that is simultaneously emotionally satisfying and economically convenient, the normal mechanisms of critical evaluation tend to fail. The question of whether the explanation is true becomes less important than the question of whether acting on it makes the fear stop, even temporarily, and whether it produces material benefits for the people doing the acting. The people who burned the Jewish communities of the Rhineland were not, in their own minds, committing atrocities. They were solving a problem. They were, as Michael de Leone put it, executing God's judgment on people who had earned it. The fact that the problem was fictitious, that there was no poisoning conspiracy, that Jews were dying of the plague in the same proportions as everyone else, was irrelevant to the emotional and economic logic of the violence. This is not a lesson about medieval people being uniquely cruel or uniquely irrational. It is a lesson about what happens to human judgment under conditions of extreme fear, economic stress, and institutional failure. The same mechanism, the search for a human cause, the identification of a convenient target, the construction of an accusation that satisfies psychological and economic needs simultaneously, has operated in every century before and since. In every culture that has produced sufficient documentation for historians to trace it, the Black Death did not create anti-Semitism in Europe. It inherited a structure of hatred that had been building for centuries. The theological accusation of deicide, the economic resentment generated by the prohibition on Christian money lending that had pushed Jews into financial occupations, the social segregation that made Jews simultaneously visible and incomprehensible to their Christian neighbours. What the plague did was provide the occasion to activate that structure at maximum intensity across an entire continent within a compressed period of time. The result was a demographic catastrophe within the catastrophe, the destruction of Jewish communities that had been part of European urban life for centuries, communities that would not be rebuilt for generations, in some cases not until the modern period, and in some cases not at all. And through all of it, through the burnings and the processions and the seizure of property and the cancellation of debts, the plague continued. The rats moved through the ruins of the Jewish quarters just as they had moved through the Christian ones. The fleas did not distinguish between the baptized and the unbaptized. The bacteria killed without prejudice. The violence had not stopped anything. It had not addressed anything. It had not even, in any meaningful sense, made the fear go away. What it had done was reveal something about the societies that produced it, something that those societies would spend the next several centuries slowly, painfully, inadequately trying to confront. That revelation, the exposure of what lies beneath the surface of civilization when the surface is stripped away by catastrophe, is perhaps the most important legacy of the plague years. Not the death toll, not the economic disruption, not the political reorganization, but the knowledge, purchased at an unbearable price, of what human beings are capable of when they are frightened enough. It is knowledge we have not finished absorbing. Chapter 6. The World the Plague Made, Power, Money, and the Ruins of the Old Order. Let us begin with a number. In the year 1427, roughly 80 years after the first wave of the Black Death, the city of Florence conducted a comprehensive census for tax purposes. Every household was recorded. Unquote. Every household was recorded. every person was counted. The results were analysed, debated, and eventually accepted as the most reliable population data available for any major European city in the medieval period. The number of people living in Florence in 1427 was 37,048. Before the Black Death arrived in 1348, Florence had been home to somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 people. In 80 years, accounting for the first wave of the plague and the 5 subsequent waves that struck the city in the generations that followed, the population had collapsed to roughly a third of what it had been. Think about what that means in human terms, not statistically, but concretely. Walk through a city of 100,000 people. Now remove 2 out of every 3. Remove the people from the houses, the people from the markets, the people from the guild halls and the churches and the banks and the workshops. Leave the buildings standing, but empty the streets. That is the world that the survivors of the Black Death woke up into. And here is the thing about that world, the thing that almost every chronicle from the period records with a mixture of outrage, bewilderment, and something that occasionally looks like guilt. It was, for the people at the bottom of European society, in many ways better than the world before. The wages of gravediggers had skyrocketed during the plague. But it was not just gravediggers. Across the continent, in city after city, in guild after guild, in farm after farm, the same phenomenon was occurring. Labour was suddenly, dramatically, irreversibly scarce. And scarce labour was expensive labour. For the first time in generations, in some cases for the first time in recorded memory, ordinary workers had something that resembled bargaining power. The earthquake had happened. Now came the aftershocks. And the aftershocks would reshape European civilization in ways that are still visible today. To understand what the plague did to European economics, you need to understand what European economics looked like before the plague arrived. Medieval European society was built on a fundamental asymmetry. There were many more people who needed to work than there were opportunities to employ them. This asymmetry was not an accident. It was the structural foundation of a society in which the people who owned land and capital held almost all the bargaining power, and the people who owned nothing but their own labour had almost none. The surplus of labour meant that wages stayed low, not because employers were necessarily cruel, though many were, but because the basic dynamics of supply and demand operated in their favour. If a peasant demanded better terms from his lord, there were a dozen other peasants willing to work for less. If an urban craftsman asked for higher pay, his employer could find another craftsman. The surplus of desperate people kept the price of human labour pinned near subsistence. The plague destroyed that surplus overnight. When between a third and a half of the population dies in the span of a few months, the relationship between labour supply and labour demand inverts with brutal completeness. Suddenly, there are not enough workers. Suddenly, the workers who remain can demand and receive wages that would have been unthinkable the previous year. Suddenly, the peasant can negotiate the terms of his tenancy, because if his lord refuses, the field will simply go unplanted and the lord will starve alongside everyone else. The chronicler Marcione di Copo Stefani, whose rage at the plague's social consequences we have already heard, documented the economic dislocation of post-plague Florence with the precision of a man watching his own wealth evaporate. Tailors demanded fees so high that no one could pay them. Workers of every description named their own prices. The great houses of the dead stood empty, while the people who had previously been too poor to own anything inherited, occupied, and claimed them. For Marcione, this was moral catastrophe. The divinely ordained social order was being overturned. People were rising above their station. The wrong people were getting rich. He was not wrong about what was happening. He was wrong about what it meant. What was happening was not moral collapse. It was an economic correction, brutal, chaotic, and long overdue, that was beginning to transfer wealth and bargaining power downward through the social hierarchy in ways that the old order had successfully prevented for centuries. The people at the bottom were not becoming rich because they were sinning. They were becoming less poor because the catastrophic reduction in their numbers had finally given them something they had never had before: scarcity value. Across Europe, the pattern repeated itself with variations that reflected local conditions but shared a common underlying dynamic. Agricultural labourers demanded and received higher wages. Tenant farmers renegotiated their leases on terms more favourable to themselves. The lords who owned land found that keeping that land productive required making concessions they had never previously been willing to make. In some regions, this process was relatively peaceful, a gradual, grudging adjustment as landlords recognized that the alternative was unfarmed land and no income at all. In other regions, it was violently contested. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which peasants from across southeastern England marched on London, killed several members of the Royal Council, and briefly occupied the Tower of London before being suppressed, was, in significant part, a consequence of the labour dynamics unleashed by the Black Death a generation earlier. The lords had tried to reimpose pre-plague wage levels through legislation. The peasants, having experienced what it felt like to be economically indispensable, refused to go back. The German Peasants' War of 1524 and 1525, one of the largest popular uprisings in European history before the French Revolution, followed a similar logic, amplified by a century and a half of accumulated grievance rooted in the same post-plague economic transformation. The plague did not cause these uprisings directly, but it created the conditions, the experience of relative economic power, the memory of a world in which labour was scarce and workers could make demands that made those uprisings thinkable. But here is the complication, the part of the story that complicates any simple narrative of the plague as a liberating force for the poor. While labour became more expensive and ordinary workers gained bargaining power, the plague also accelerated a very different kind of concentration at the top of European society. The great families, the established powers, the people who had held authority before the catastrophe, in most cases, they held it more firmly afterward. The mechanism was subtle, but consistent. Major catastrophes create openings, vacancies in political office, gaps in commercial networks, empty positions in guild hierarchies that need to be filled quickly. And the people best positioned to fill them quickly are usually the people who already have connections, capital, and social standing. The new rich that Marchione despised so bitterly were, in most cases, not really new at all. They were members of established families, younger sons, distant cousins, provincial branches, who moved into positions opened by the deaths of their more prominent relatives. The genuinely new, the people with no prior connection to power, no family network, no accumulated capital, found the doors opened by catastrophe closing almost as quickly as they had opened. The established families permitted a certain amount of reshuffling within the elite. They did not permit the wholesale transformation of the social hierarchy that the plague's death toll might have made possible. This was not accidental, it was deliberate, and in Florence, it produced one of the most remarkable political transformations of the medieval period. The rise of the Medici family to effective control of a republic that had spent a century and a half congratulating itself on its democratic institutions. The Medici story is, among other things, a story about what happens when catastrophic population loss meets concentrated financial power in a society that has been structurally weakened but has not yet developed new ways of organizing itself. The Medici family was not, in 1348, particularly prominent. They were wealthy merchants, bankers and wool traders, like dozens of other Florentine families, but they were not among the great houses that dominated the city's political life. The Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Strozzi, these were the names that mattered. The Medici were, by the standards of 14th century Florence, respectable but not exceptional. By 1434, they effectively controlled the city. Understanding how that transformation happened requires understanding what the plague did to the political arithmetic of Florence over the course of 8 decades and 5 waves of epidemic. In the political system of the Florentine Republic, effective power rested with the men who were eligible to hold the highest offices of the state, a group drawn from the major and minor guilds, filtered through a system of committees, lists, and electoral procedures that were supposed to ensure broad participation and prevent any single family from accumulating too much influence. Before the plague, this system had to manage the ambitions and interests of a political class of perhaps 20,000 eligible men in a city of 100,000. After 80 years of plague, that city had 37,000 people. The political class had shrunk proportionally. The number of men whose votes and support needed to be won, whose allegiance needed to be maintained, whose economic interests needed to be accommodated, was now a fraction of what it had once been. In that shrunken political world, large amounts of money could do things that had previously been impossible. Not because the Medici were the first wealthy family in Florence to understand that money could buy political influence, they certainly were not, but because the concentration of wealth in fewer hands, combined with the reduction in the number of people whose support needed to be purchased, created a situation in which a single family with sufficient resources could build a coalition large enough to control the Republic's institutions. Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1389, the grandson of a generation that had survived the plague and accumulated wealth in its aftermath, understood this arithmetic with the clarity of a natural politician. He understood that in a city of 37,000, with a political class of perhaps 2,000, a family with essentially unlimited credit and an understanding of how to deploy it strategically could construct a majority coalition and maintain it indefinitely. He also understood something more subtle, that in a world still haunted by the memory of plague, the most effective political identity was that of a saviour, a protector, someone who stood between the city and the catastrophe that might return. The name Medici means, in Italian, physicians. The family coat of arms featured small spheres that were interpreted as either pills or coins, the tools of healing and commerce combined. Cosimo went further. He changed his publicly celebrated birthday to September 27th, the feast day of the early Christian martyr St. Cosmas, who was venerated as a miraculous healer. He commissioned paintings that depicted him not as a banker or a political operator, but as a figure of providential significance, a man sent by God to stand between Florence and destruction, in the same position that Noah had occupied between humanity and the flood. The most extraordinary of these commissions was a fresco painted by Paolo Uccello in the green cloister of Santa Maria Novella, the same church where Boccaccio's fictional plague refugees had gathered before fleeing the city. The official subject of the fresco was the end of the Great Flood, but the figure receiving Noah's blessing, the person identified by his distinctive features as the true saviour of humanity, wore the unmistakable face of Cosimo de' Medici. This was not subtle. It was not meant to be subtle. It was a political advertisement painted in the language of sacred art, telling the people of Florence that the man who had saved them from the flood, who had saved them from the plague, who would save them from whatever came next, was standing right here, managing their city, protecting their prosperity, available for continued service. And it worked. Not immediately, not without conflict. The story of Cosimo's rise included exile, conspiracy, and the ruthless elimination of rival factions. But it worked in the long run, in the way that only things rooted in genuine structural conditions can work. The plague had changed the arithmetic. Cosimo understood the new arithmetic. And the Medici would rule Florence, in one form or another, for the next 3 centuries. While the Medici were building their dynasty at the top of Florentine society, something different was happening at the bottom, something harder to document precisely, because the people at the bottom of medieval society left fewer written records, but something real enough that its traces are visible in the chronicles, the court records, and the economic data of the period. The people who had survived the plague, particularly the urban workers and the rural peasants who had gained bargaining power through their scarcity, were behaving differently than they had before. Not dramatically differently, not in ways that immediately threatened the social order, but differently enough that the people above them noticed and recorded their discomfort. The workers were more confident. They negotiated. They made demands. They dressed in ways that their betters considered inappropriate to their station. They spent money on food and clothing and entertainment rather than saving it and deferring to the consumption patterns of the wealthy. They moved between employers, between cities, between regions, in ways that the pre-plague labour surplus had made impossible, and that the legal attempts to restrict wages and movement, the Statute of Labourers in England, similar legislation across the continent, could not fully suppress. There was something new in the air. Not freedom exactly. The social hierarchy was still intact. The legal subordination of the poor was still enforced. The violence available to the powerful to maintain their dominance was still overwhelming. But the experience of economic leverage, the memory of a moment when ordinary human labour had been genuinely scarce and genuinely valued, had done something to the psychology of the people who had lived through it. It had given them, in the words of the Florentine chronicler writing about the post-plague lower classes, a new kind of self-confidence, a new sense that the position they occupied in the social hierarchy was not necessarily permanent, that the hierarchy itself was not necessarily divinely ordained. That death, which had struck the lords and the bishops and the rich merchants with the same indifference it had shown toward the poor, had demonstrated something important, that the pretensions of the powerful rested on no firmer foundation than the pretensions of anyone else. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing a century and a half later, reconstructing the speech of a leader of the Ciompi revolt through his own analytic imagination, put this insight in language that the actual participants in that revolt probably could not have articulated so precisely, but would have. Recognized as true, those who have gotten great wealth and power got it through fraud or force, and those who lack the insight or the courage to follow the same path will remain in dependence and poverty forever. This is a radical thought. It is a thought that the Black Death made possible, not by inspiring it directly, but by creating the conditions in which it could be thought, by demonstrating, through 6 years of indiscriminate killing, that the social hierarchy was not a reflection of divine will, that the rich died, that the powerful died, and not that no office or title or accumulation of wealth provided any reliable protection against a flea. If God had not arranged the deaths to reflect the moral worth of the victims, and the evidence was overwhelming that he had not, then maybe God had not arranged the living arrangements to reflect moral worth either. Maybe the Lord's ownership of the land and the peasant's obligation to work it were not eternal truths written in the heavens. Maybe they were just arrangements that some people found convenient, enforced by violence, and maintained by the absence of imagination about alternatives. This thought, embryonic, inarticulate, expressed in the actions of striking workers and rioting peasants, rather than in philosophical treatises, is one of the most important legacies of the Black Death. Not because it immediately produced a more equal or more just society. It did not. The revolts were suppressed. The hierarchies reasserted themselves. The Ciompi went back to their wool combing under conditions not dramatically better than before. But the thought had been thought. The question had been asked. And questions, once asked loudly enough, have a way of persisting. Of all the institutions damaged by the Black Death, none suffered more profound and more lasting harm than the Roman Catholic Church. The damage was not primarily a matter of personnel losses, though the losses were severe. Clergy died in disproportionate numbers, because their duties, visiting the sick, administering last rites, maintaining the hospitals and hospices that served the dying poor, brought them into precisely the kinds of contact that most efficiently transmitted the plague. Some estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of European clergy died in the first wave, though the numbers vary enormously by region, and the records are too incomplete to permit precision. The damage went deeper than bodies. It was a damage to authority, to the fundamental claim of the Church that it stood in a privileged relationship with God, that its sacraments were efficacious, that its prayers were heard, that its guidance was trustworthy. The plague challenged every one of these claims simultaneously. If the Church's prayers had been heard, why had God not responded? If the sacraments were efficacious, why had the clergy who administered them died in such large numbers? If the Church's guidance was trustworthy, why had its guidance, pray, repent, attend Mass, contribute to indulgences, done nothing to protect the faithful from a disease that killed them as efficiently as it killed everyone else? There were answers to these questions, and theologians provided them with considerable ingenuity. God's ways were mysterious. The plague was a test of faith. The clergy had died because their exceptional virtue made them particularly pleasing to God as sacrificial victims. These answers were not without internal logic, but they required a degree of theological sophistication that most ordinary believers did not possess. And they asked people who had just watched their families die to extend a level of trust to an institution that had manifestly failed to protect them. The trust, for many people, did not survive. What emerged from the wreckage of that trust was not, in most cases, a rejection of Christianity. The 14th century was not producing atheists in any significant number. What it was producing was something more subtle and in some ways more radical, a desire to find a more direct, more personal, more reliable relationship with God than the institutional church seemed capable of providing. This desire took many forms. The mystical movements that flourished in the late 14th century, women visionaries, lay devotional communities, individual piety that bypassed the formal sacramental system, were in significant part responses to the institutional church's failure during the plague years. The conviction that salvation required the mediation of a corrupt and ineffective priesthood was becoming harder to sustain. The idea that a direct relationship with God, achieved through personal prayer and individual moral effort, might be not just permissible but preferable, was gaining ground. 1 century after the Black Death, Johannes Gutenberg would print his first Bible. Literate Christians across Europe would, for the first time, be able to read the text that was supposed to be the foundation of their faith without depending on the clergy to interpret it for them. The Reformation, with its insistence on individual access to Scripture, its rejection of priestly mediation, its challenge to the authority of Rome, was not caused by the printing press alone. It was caused, in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but impossible to deny entirely, by the questions that the Black Death had raised about whether the institution that claimed to stand between humanity and God had any reliable connection to God at all. By 1353, 6 years after the first ships arrived in Sicily, the first great wave of the Black Death had passed through Europe and burned itself out, not because anything had been done to stop it, not because the prayers had been answered or the treatments had worked or the persecutions had frightened it away. It burned out because it had run out of people who had not yet been exposed to it, because the surviving population had, in many cases, developed some degree of immune resistance, because the ecological conditions that had supported its initial explosive spread had, temporarily, been disrupted. It would come back. It came back in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, in 1380, and in dozens of subsequent waves that continued to strike European populations periodically until the early 18th century, by which point, for reasons that are still not entirely understood, the disease simply stopped being epidemic in Western Europe. But the first wave, the Great Mortality, as contemporaries called it, was the one that broke the world. The subsequent wave struck a society that had already absorbed the initial shock, that had begun to adapt its institutions and its thinking to the new demographic reality, that had started building the scaffolding of the Renaissance and the early modern period on the ruins of what the plague had destroyed. Those subsequent waves were terrible. They killed hundreds of thousands more people. They continued to disrupt economies and institutions and families. But they did not have the power to astonish that the first wave had possessed, the power to encounter a civilization that had no framework for what it was experiencing, and to shatter that framework entirely. That shattering, the moment when the most sophisticated society in the Western world discovered that it had no answer to the most basic question a civilization can face, which is how to protect its people from death, was the Black Death's most enduring legacy. Not the bodies, not the economic disruption, not even the political transformation, as significant as that transformation was. The legacy was the question. The irreversible discovery that the answers that had organized European civilization for 1,000 years, the church's answers, the king's answers, the physician's answers, the astrologer's answers, were insufficient. That the world was more complex, more indifferent to human wishes, more resistant to human control than anyone had previously been willing to admit. From that discovery, purchased at a price that defies calculation, something new began to grow, slowly, painfully, with many false starts and many failures. But it grew. Chapter 7. The Children of the Plague, a Saint, a Merchant, and the World That Would Not Change. There is a particular kind of person that catastrophe produces, not the heroes, those exist in every age, and their stories, while genuinely admirable, tend to follow familiar patterns, not the villains, the opportunists and profiteers whose behaviour during the Black Death we have already examined in some detail, but a third type, stranger and more interesting than either, the people who were so completely shaped by catastrophe that they became something that would not have been possible in any other world. Something that the world before the plague could not have imagined, and that the world after the plague could not have produced without it. The 14th century gave us two extraordinary examples of this type, and they are worth examining at length, not because they were typical, but precisely because they were not. They represent the extreme edges of what the plague made possible. On one side, a woman who transformed her suffering into spiritual authority so absolute that she gave instructions to popes. On the other, a man who transformed his suffering into wealth so enormous that he became one of the richest people in Europe and who spent every day of his life unable to enjoy a single florin of it. One became a saint, one became a capitalist, and both of them, in their different ways, were children of the plague, formed by it, defined by it, unable to be understood without it. Their stories are the truest mirror the 14th century holds up to our own time, because in the gap between what the saint sought and what the merchant achieved, in the space between the hunger for meaning and the hunger for security, we find the essential psychological inheritance of the Black Death, the wound that the plague opened in the human imagination, the wound that, 7 centuries later, has not entirely closed. In the year 1347, in the city of Siena, a cloth dyer named Giacomo di Benincasa and his wife Lapa welcomed their 24th child into the world. They named her Caterina. The following year the plague arrived in Siena. Siena in 1348 was one of the most devastated cities in Italy. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura, the same man who reported Milan's miraculous escape with barely concealed resentment, described burying his own 5 children with his own hands, because no one else could be found to do. To it, he described the dead lying in the streets, the collapse of all normal social order, the terror that had made Siena into a city of ghosts before the summer was over. Caterina di Benincasa survived. She was an infant during the worst of it, too young to remember in any conscious sense, but old enough to absorb, old enough to grow up in a household that had lost siblings, neighbours, the ordinary scaffolding of a normal childhood, old enough to breathe air saturated with the aftermath of mass death, the grief, the theological confusion, the desperate search for meaning that characterised Siena and every other Italian city in the years following the Great Mortality. She grew up strange. That is the most honest way to put it. From childhood, she experienced visions. She refused to eat in ways that alarmed her family. She spoke with an authority about spiritual matters that people several times her age found difficult to dismiss. She joined the lay Dominicans, the Sisters of Penance, while still a teenager, and began a life of radical asceticism that made her a figure of both reverence and concern to those around her. By her mid-20s, Catherine had begun to attract disciples, men and women, educated and uneducated, wealthy and poor, who gathered around her not because she sought them but because they sought her. She had a quality that is difficult to describe in secular terms, but that the 14th century would have recognized immediately: authority. Not the authority of office or title or wealth or gender. She had none of these. Not the authority of education. She was illiterate for most of her adult life, dictating her letters and her treatises to secretaries, but a moral authority so palpable that people who encountered her found themselves unable to dismiss it. She began writing letters, hundreds of them, to merchants, to nobles, to soldiers, to her disciples, to the heads of Italian city-states, and eventually to the Pope. The Pope she wrote to was Gregory XI, the last French Pope who had maintained the papacy in Avignon, in comfortable, luxurious, politically convenient Avignon for the entirety of his pontificate. Catherine wrote to him the way a mother writes to a wayward child, with love that did not soften the directness of the rebuke. She called him Daddy, Babbo in Italian, a term of endearment so incongruous applied to the supreme head of the Roman Catholic Church that it becomes, on the page, a kind of audacity. She told him to come home, to return the papacy to Rome, where it belonged, where the tombs of the apostles were, where the church had been founded. She told him that he was surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, and that this was a form of spiritual cowardice. She told him that God was watching, and that God was not impressed. In 1377, Gregory XI moved the papacy back to Rome. The historians who have studied this period are careful to note that Gregory had many reasons for returning to Rome, and that Catherine's letters were one factor among several, political, diplomatic, and ecclesiastical, that contributed to his decision. This is certainly true. Great historical events rarely have single causes. But the fact remains that the most powerful religious authority in the Western world, a man with the resources of the entire institutional church at his disposal, was writing letters back to an illiterate cloth dyer's daughter in Siena, was reading what she wrote with evident seriousness, and was, in some meaningful sense, answering to her. How is this possible? The plague is part of the answer. Not a complete answer, but an essential one. The institutional church that the Black Death had damaged was damaged precisely in the dimension of moral authority. Its clergy had fled, its hospitals had been overwhelmed, its prayers had gone unanswered. Its theological explanations for the catastrophe had ranged from the inadequate to the absurd. The gap between what the church claimed to be, the mediator between humanity and God, the custodian of salvation, the earthly embodiment of divine love, and what it had demonstrated itself to be during the plague years, was enormous. Into that gap, Catherine stepped. She was offering something the institutional church was no longer reliably providing: the experience of actual encounter with something beyond ordinary human reality. The visions, the authority, the absolute certainty, communicated through her letters and her presence, and her refusal to be intimidated by anything the world could offer, that she knew what God wanted and was prepared to say so regardless of consequences. She was also, and this is crucial, willing to suffer. Not just to suffer in the passive sense, not simply enduring what came her way, but to choose suffering as a form of engagement with the world. She nursed plague victims when others fled. She ate almost nothing. She slept almost not at all. She was, by any clinical measure, a woman in profound physical crisis for most of her adult life. But the people around her did not experience her as someone in crisis. They experienced her as someone in possession of a resource they desperately wanted: certainty. Catherine died in Rome in 1380, at the age of 33. The year of her death was also a plague year. The disease had returned to Rome, as it returned everywhere, with its remorseless periodicity. She was canonized by the Catholic Church less than 80 years after her death, an extraordinarily rapid process in an institution not known for speed. She is now one of 2 women who hold the title of Doctor of the Church, the other being Teresa of Avila, who lived 2 centuries later and was, in significant ways, following a path that Catherine had helped to clear. The plague did not make Catherine a saint, but it made the world that needed what she had to offer. It created the hunger that she fed, and the authority she achieved, the extraordinary spectacle of a woman with no official standing telling the Pope to come home. And the Pope coming home was only possible in a world that the Black Death had stripped of its comfortable certainties, leaving people desperate enough to listen to someone who claimed, with absolute conviction, to know what God actually wanted. In the same year that Catherine was born, 1347, in the Tuscan town of Prato, a child named Francesco di Marco d'Attini entered the world. Like Catherine, he was shaped by the plague from his earliest years. Unlike Catherine, what the plague made of him was not a saint. When the Black Death arrived in Prato in 1348, Francesco was perhaps a year old. His father died, his mother died, his brothers died. The specific sequence is uncertain, the records are incomplete, as they always are for families without significant social standing, but the essential fact is unambiguous. Francesco emerged from the plague as an orphan, alone in a world that had just demonstrated, with devastating efficiency, how quickly and completely everything a person depended on could disappear. He was taken in by a neighbour family. He survived. And then, at the age of roughly 15, he left Prato for the great commercial city of Florence. And from Florence he travelled to Avignon, the papal city on the Rhone, then still the centre of international commerce and ecclesiastical power, and he began to trade. He was extraordinarily good at it. Over the next 5 decades, Francesco di Marco d'Attini built one of the most remarkable commercial empires of the medieval period. He established trading companies in Avignon, in Prato, in Florence, in Genoa, in Barcelona, in Valencia, in Majorca, in Ibiza. He dealt in wool and cloth, in armour and weapons, in spices and dyes, in art objects and luxury goods, in financial instruments of increasing complexity. His archive, the extraordinary collection of letters, account books, and business records that was discovered in the walls of his house in Prato after his death, and has been studied by historians ever since, contains more than 140,000 documents. It is the most complete picture of a medieval merchant's life that has ever been found. It is also, for all its commercial achievement, a portrait of a man who could not rest. Francesco's letters to his wife Margherita, who managed his Prato operations with considerable competence while he travelled and negotiated and accumulated, reveal a man in permanent anxiety. He worried about his ships. He worried about his agents. He worried about the stability of his banking arrangements. He worried about the political conditions in the cities where his companies operated. He worried about the plague. The plague was always there, in the background of his letters, an ever-present possibility that could destroy a trading network as efficiently as it had destroyed his family. And beneath all of this practical worry, there was something deeper and harder to name, a religious dread that never left him. Francesco was not a particularly devout man in his daily practice. He did not spend long hours in prayer. He did not, like Catherine, choose suffering as a form of spiritual discipline, but he was haunted, persistently, obsessively, in the language of his letters, by the conviction that his wealth was somehow wrong, that the accumulation of so many florins, achieved through so much cleverness and effort and ruthlessness, was incompatible with the salvation of his soul. He wrote above the door of every house he occupied, in the name of God and of profit. The conjunction was not ironic. He meant both, genuinely, and he could not reconcile them. God demanded selflessness. Profit required the opposite. God demanded trust. Commerce required suspicion. God demanded presence in the present moment. The plague had taught Francesco, before he could properly speak, that the present moment was unreliable, and that the only defence against its unreliability was to accumulate enough to survive whatever came next. He accumulated enough. He became, by the end of his life, one of the wealthiest men in Tuscany, possibly one of the wealthiest men in Europe. He owned property in multiple cities. He employed hundreds of people. He had achieved, by any external measure, a security that the terrified orphan of 1348 could not have imagined, and he was never, by any internal measure, secure. The plague returns throughout his letters as a motif, not primarily as a medical event, though he tracked its periodic returns with the attention of a man whose business depended on the survival of his agents and partners, but as a psychological presence. The memory of loss, the knowledge that everything could be taken, the conviction, rooted in an experience he could not consciously remember, but that had nevertheless formed him at the deepest level of his personality, that safety was an illusion and that every period of stability was merely an interval between catastrophes. He had one child, a daughter named Ginevra, who died in infancy. He and Margherita had no other children. He spent his final years in a state of increasing religious anxiety, making and revising his will, endowing charitable institutions, trying to arrange his posthumous relationship with God with the same meticulous attention to contractual detail that he brought to his commercial arrangements. When he died in 1410, at the age of roughly 73, he left his entire estate, not to a family, because he had no surviving family, but to the city of Prato, to establish a charitable institution for the poor. The Ospedale del Seppo, which he endowed, still exists. His archive, preserved in the walls of his house for centuries, is now one of the most valuable historical resources in the world. He left behind no recorded statement of whether, at the end, he had found what he spent his life searching for. He probably had not. The plague had taught him, too early and too completely, that there was no amount of accumulation sufficient to defeat loss. And the man who knew that, who had known it since before he could speak, could never fully believe in the safety that his wealth appeared to offer. Catherine and Francesco, the saint and the merchant, two people born in the same year, in the same region, into the same catastrophe, and made by that catastrophe into utterly different kinds of human beings. Catherine's response to the plague's lesson, that everything material was unreliable, that death was the only certainty, that the world offered no lasting security, was to release her grip on the material entirely, to seek meaning in the direction of pure spirit, to build an authority based not on wealth or office or any worldly foundation, but on the absolute conviction that she had direct access to something beyond the world. Francesco's response to the same lesson was the opposite, to grip more tightly, to accumulate more systematically, to build walls of commercial complexity between himself and the loss that the plague had shown him was always possible, to seek security through the relentless expansion of the resources available to defend against catastrophe. Both strategies failed. In their own ways, Catherine's body gave out under the demands she placed on it. She died at 33, having given everything, and whatever peace she found was not available to the people who needed her most after she was gone. Francesco's wealth could not purchase the peace he sought. He died at 73, having accumulated everything, and the anxiety that had driven his accumulation did not diminish as the accumulation grew. But both strategies were also, in their different ways, enormously productive. Catherine's absolute conviction produced a new model of female spiritual authority that echoed through European Christianity for centuries. Francesco's commercial anxiety produced the most complete archive of medieval business practice in existence, a monument to the relentless, systematic, magnificently obsessive application of human intelligence to the problem of making money survive in an uncertain world. The plague made both of them possible, not by inspiring them with some grand vision of what could be built from ruins, but by stripping away, at the earliest possible moment, the comfortable assumption that the world was a safe place where ordinary human effort was sufficient to keep catastrophe at bay. It was not a gentle education. It never is. We began this story with a question that the survivors of the Black Death could not answer. Why? We have travelled through 6 years of catastrophe, the ships arriving in Sicily, the bodies piling up in Florence, the sealed houses of Milan, the burning of Jewish communities in the Rhineland, the Flagellants marching through German cities, the economic upheaval that followed the dying, the political transformations that reorganized European power in the plague's wake. And now, at the end, we return to the question that Matteo Villani asked in the exhausted aftermath of 1348. Did the world become better? His answer was no. The people who survived the plague did not become more virtuous, more generous, more humble before God and each other. They became in many cases more selfish, more acquisitive, more determined to enjoy the time they had without worrying about whether their enjoyment was morally appropriate. The orphans inherited the palaces and spent the money. The workers demanded higher wages and spent those too. The nobles who had preached restraint retreated to their country houses and forgot the lessons they had claimed to have learned. He was right about this, and the pattern he identified is one that every subsequent catastrophe has reproduced. Mass disaster does not reliably produce moral improvement. It produces, instead, an intense and temporary awareness of mortality, followed by a return, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, but almost always a return to the ordinary patterns of human behavior that existed before the disaster. But something else happened too, something that Matteo Villani was alive to see but perhaps not positioned to fully understand. The world that emerged from the Black Death was not the same world that had entered it. Not morally, Matteo was right about that, but structurally, intellectually, in the slow, deep ways that civilizations change when the assumptions on which they were built are proven inadequate. The plague created a space, a vacancy in the architecture of European thought where the old certainties used to be, the church's certainties, the medical establishment's certainties, the political certainties that had organized European society for 1,000 years. Into that space, over the next 2 centuries, something new grew. It grew in the studios of Florentine artists who began painting human beings with a new attention to their physical reality, their weight, their musculature, their presence in 3-dimensional space that had not been possible when human bodies were primarily understood as temporary vessels for immortal souls. It grew in the workshops of scholars who began reading ancient texts, not as repositories of religious authority, but as evidence of human intelligence applied to human problems. It grew in the minds of merchants like Francesco Dottini who needed, for purely practical reasons, to understand how money worked, how markets worked, how risk could be calculated and managed and distributed across commercial networks, and who, in developing those understandings, were creating the foundations of modern economics. It grew, in other words, into the Renaissance, into the scientific revolution, into the modern world. This is not a comfortable story. The price of the Renaissance was 25 million dead. The price of the modern world was paid in the burning Jewish quarters of Strasbourg and Frankfurt, in the sealed houses of Milan, in the bodies stacked like lasagna, in trenches beside the Arno River. The transformation of European civilization that followed the Black Death was real and, in many respects, genuinely remarkable. But it was not a gift. It was not a reward for suffering. It was simply what happened next, in the way that things always happen next, in the absence of any guarantee that next will be better. The plague asked a question. The question was, "What are you? When everything you thought protected you is gone." Catherine answered, "I am what connects me to God." Francesco answered, "I am what I have managed to accumulate." Boccaccio answered, "I am what I can imagine, and what I can make others imagine." Machiavelli, who was born in 1469, more than a century after the Black Death, but who grew up in the Florence it had made, answered, "I am what I understand about how power actually works, as opposed to how it claims to work." None of these answers are complete. None of them are entirely satisfying. But all of them were made possible by the same terrible education, the education of a civilization that encountered something it could not explain, could not stop, and could not survive unchanged. The Black Death ended. It always ends. The plague burns through the available population, finds its limits, retreats. Life resumes. Children are born. New houses are built in the empty lots where old houses stood. The markets reopen. The churches fill again. The ordinary rhythms of human existence reassert themselves with an insistence that is, depending on how you look at it, either a testament to human resilience or evidence of the remarkable human capacity to forget. But the questions it asks do not end. They persist in the structures of the world it made, in the politics and the economics and the art and the theology that grew from its ruins. They persist in every subsequent catastrophe, which asks the same questions again, in a different register, to a different generation that has forgotten the answers the previous generation struggled toward. They persist, perhaps, in you, in the particular quality of attention you bring to a world that has, in recent memory, asked some of those same questions again. What are you? When everything you thought protected you is gone, what do you do with the time that remains? What do you build in the space where certainty used to be? The 14th century spent 6 years and 25 million lives learning that these are not abstract questions. They are the only questions that, in the end, matter. And the answers, imperfect, incomplete, purchased at a price no one would willingly pay, are what we call civilization.